Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about Czech politics, which I've followed really, I guess, on and off, but fairly consistently for the past 20 years or so. I'm going to talk about the election. We obviously had to change the original title, which was Zeman or Drahoš. We now know it was Zeman, so the incumbent president of the Czech Republic, former Social Democrat Prime Minister Miloš Zeman, was slightly against expectations, re-elected fairly narrowly in a runoff when voting last Friday and Saturday. So it's a story of Zeman again. So he won with 51.36% of the vote, so it was a closer vote than in the previous presidential elections, which were the first direct presidential elections in 2013. And he was challenged by Jiří Drahoš, who was an independent candidate. He's a former head of the Czech Academy of Sciences, but without any previous involvement in Czech party politics. The votes in both the first round and the second round runoff was seen as polarizing the Czech Republic along various social and geographical lines. So if we look at the vote in the Czech Republic geographically, with Zeman is red and Drahoš is blue, we can see that, first of all, Drahoš's vote is concentrated in Prague and the Prague region. If you look more closely, you can see that Drahoš did well in most, but not all, provincial capitals. So if you look down to the right, you can see Brno, the Czech Republic's second city. And correspondingly, Miloš Zeman did better in north and west Bohemia, and also in Moravia, so that's the eastern part of the Czech Republic. You can possibly see there where there's a sort of deeper shade of red that kicks in about 2/3 of the way across. And that very deep shade of red just in the northeast is the Moravia-Silesia region, so it's around the sort of industrial, post-industrial town, city of Ostrava. So there's a very marked geographical pattern. You can see it there. That's Zeman's vote, illustrated again. And there you can see very weak support for Zeman in Prague, and also to an extent, quite a significant extent, in other regional capitals. And Drahoš's support is rather opposite. Socially, there wasn't an exit poll. Czech television doesn't do exit polls anymore, but there are some very clear correlates for the two candidates' vote. Miloš Zeman's vote is very clearly correlated with age. Older Czech voters voted much more heavily for Miloš Zeman than younger Czech voters. So this is a correlation with the average age of population by commune. Correspondingly, Drahoš's support correlates very markedly with communes where there is a higher average level of higher education. Interestingly, income wasn't that much of a distinguishing factor. So what we are possibly starting to see with this election, which has been a pattern in Czech party elections, is that rather than the kind of fairly clear left-right division based on economic interests and based on wealth, which we saw in Czech politics really from the mid-90s, we're starting to see a slightly more kind of cultural division, kind of cross-cutting that. The Czech Republic stood out in Central and Eastern Europe because its politics were all about distributional questions rather than the kind of cultural, moral questions which have always loomed large in Poland and Hungary. That seems to be changing. In terms of which voters of which party backed Miloš Zeman, parties didn't, on the whole, put up candidates. That was largely because they realised that they didn't have enough support to get someone into the second round. The Czech Republic's largest party, which won the October parliamentary elections by a very clear margin, the ANO movement of Prime Minister designate and billionaire Andrej Babiš might have fielded a candidate, but it chose not to, and that was part of the informal political pact between Babiš and Zeman. Zeman has just renominated Babiš as Prime Minister for a second time after Babiš failed to form a coalition at the first attempt. I'll say something more about that later on. Although parties didn't field candidates and didn't really endorse candidates very strongly in the first round, they did in the second round, and it's very clear that the vote does break down between the two candidates on party lines. So the voters for the ANO movement, led by Andrej Babiš, who endorsed Zeman, did very largely vote for Zeman in the runoff. ANO is, at least on paper, a centrist movement, and some figures were very unhappy with the endorsement of Zeman. Some accepted it because it was part of a kind of power pact on pragmatic lines. Drahoš was critical of Babiš. Babiš is facing, or should be facing, no, indeed he is facing, an indictment for a EU subsidy fraud about 10 years ago, when he is alleged to have falsely claimed EU support for a pet project of his, the Stork's Nest Resort, which is near Prague. Central building looks like a giant stork's nest. He's accused of falsely representing his very large conglomerate as a small business. So Drahoš was critical of Babiš and said that while he saw him as a mainstream figure, while he recognised he was the winner of the elections, he wouldn't appoint him as Prime Minister. And so two kind of radical, or if you prefer, extremist parties in Czech politics. There's the communists, who are fairly unreformed, who've been around for really since the fall of communism, a niche party supported by older voters, and a new party, the SPD, the Movement for Freedom and Direct Democracy, led by the intriguing figure of the Czech-Japanese businessman Tomio Okamura, known initially to Czech voters as one of the judges on the local version of Dragon's Den, later went into politics, later moved to the far right, so he's a sort of motor-mouthed populist, opposed to immigration, hostile towards Roma, hostile towards Muslims. His party polled about 12% in October, and voters of Okamura and of the communists very heavily backed Miloš Zeman. Miloš Zeman is a former Social Democratic Prime Minister. Social Democratic Party was once one of the major forces in Czech politics. It's been gradually losing support, and it was cut down to a mere 7% in the most recent parliamentary elections. But nevertheless, its supporters, although the party's leaders were fairly bitterly divided over Miloš Zeman, its supporters voted heavily for Miloš Zeman. Voters of other parties, mainly centre-right parties, Christian Democrats, kind of Eurosceptic, pro-market, conservative, civic Democrats, voted heavily for Drahoš. So there was a breakdown by parties of the left, radical parties, and the kind of new anti-establishment party, ANO. These supporters tended to back Zeman. Zeman wasn't expected to win on the whole. All the polls showed Drahoš beating him in the runoff, although by an increasingly narrow margin. The last legally published polls, published about 3 or 4 days before polling, showed Drahoš just winning by 0.5%. But in the event, things were the other way round, a narrow Zeman win, and this is the reason that they were. Miloš Zeman succeeded in mobilising voters who had not voted in the first round, which he won fairly comfortably, although with a smaller vote than many had expected. In the second round, he succeeded in mobilising voters who hadn't previously turned out. Turnout was up everywhere, so turnout was up to 66% from 61.5%. But it increased more in Zeman supporting areas. So this means that, in particular, younger voters, very often supporters of the radical right, turned out or were mobilised in the last week of campaigning to vote for Miloš Zeman. And that's really what won him the election. plus the fact that he did somewhat better than expected in provincial cities and recouped more support from defeated first-round candidates than had been expected. 5 of the 7 eliminated first-round candidates endorsed Drahoš, appeared on stage with him, urged their supporters to vote for him, but enough of them didn't to put Miloš Zeman back in Prague Castle. Okay, let's just sort of turn back to the campaign. Let's turn to Drahoš. Drahoš and really all of the other candidates running against Zeman were running on a very similar platform. They were almost all independents, apart from a couple of fringe party candidates, and the former Prime Minister Mirek Topolánek, who had left his party, the Civic Democrats, and was also formerly an independent. And Drahoš was really running on a very vague program, which essentially amounted to the fact that he wasn't Miloš Zeman. So here his campaign poster says something along the lines that he's a new face, he has an unblemished record. Unlike Miloš Zeman, who is controversial, both because of his kind of populist views, his anti-immigration stances, his endorsement of Donald Trump. He was the only EU head of state ahead of the US elections to endorse Donald Trump. His very sharply anti-Muslim views, and his somewhat embarrassing record of how can one put it, lacking some of the dignity that we might expect a head of state. He was very notoriously appeared to be drunk at a ceremonial occasion. He used the C word in a radio broadcast. So he was seen as somebody who was too crude and too maverick to be president. Drahoš's pitch was that he had dignity, he had gravitas, he was reliably pro-Western, unlike Zeman, who was accommodating towards Russian interests, as his foreign travel has been very significantly to countries in the former Soviet Union. Drahoš was, as I've said, not a politician. He was the former head of the Academy of Sciences. He did this job pretty shrewdly. He's known to have lobbied very effectively against cuts, but he was a fairly unknown figure to the Czech public. Now, the game plan around Drahoš and around all the other candidates who were running on very similar, fairly non-specific independent platforms was really to do what these 2 candidates had done, to repeat the success of independent candidates in presidential elections in Slovakia and in Romania in 2014, when very powerful, populist, charismatic figures on the left were beaten by independents who were able to draw in a very broad coalition of voters from the right and centre and from elsewhere to defeat these left-wing, not quite incumbents, but they were former prime ministers who were very well known. So Andrej Kiska on the left defeats Robert Fico in 2014, overhauls him in the second round, runoff round, and Karl Iohannis, current president of Romania, does the same against Victor Ponta. These are fairly minor. So Kiska is a businessman. Iohannis is a local politician, represents a minor party. So the game plan seems to have been that this would take place in the Czech Republic. The parties had stepped back from fielding fielding candidates, and it seemed that this was going to be the case. So, as in the first round, Zeman is very clearly first, but with 38.56%. But this is considered disappointing. Polls had suggested he'd get 44%. Drahoš some way behind with 26 or 27%, but he was expected to really pull ahead in the second round. As I mentioned, the other candidates who were all very far behind him, campaigning on a similar pitch of being independent non-politicians who were pro-Western and had the dignity, the gravitas that Zeman didn't. Almost all endorsed him. So there's Pavel Fischer, the former diplomat, who came third. There's Michal Horáček, who describes himself brilliantly on the ballot paper as writer, writer, lyricist and social anthropologist, but is better known to the Czech public as the very rich owner of the Czech Republic's first commercial betting firm. Marek Hilscher is a doctor and social activist. So it was expected that the support of these candidates, or 5 of them, for Drahoš would really make it easy for him to overhaul Zeman. So here's Horáček, the rich 4th place candidate, the writer and social anthropologist, and his billboards are being given over to Drahoš in the 2nd round and painted with a vote Drahoš sticker. Miloš Zeman waged an interesting campaign. He said it was a non-campaign. He said he wasn't campaigning at all. He said he was just going to let his record speak for itself. So he didn't appear on any television programs with the other candidates. He didn't give very many media interviews, and he seemed to be carrying out a kind of rose garden strategy. There was speculation that this was a strategy dictated by his health. He has diabetes, he has difficulty walking because of a complication associated with diabetes, neuropathy, and he is known to, let's say his doctors have expressed concern in the past about his alcohol and tobacco consumption. So there's speculation that this was partly because he just wasn't really healthy enough to campaign actively. He did, however, make a very large number of presidential visits to provinces and regional towns over the preceding year. When he would speak to crowds, he would field usually not very challenging questions. So he was pursuing what some people saw as an under-the-radar campaign, but he was really not very visible in the 1st round campaign, which was overshadowed by October's parliamentary elections and then the fallout from that, the difficulties of forming a government. So we don't really see much of Miloš Zeman, and he claims he's not campaigning, so all candidates had to have a so-called transparent account where you can look up online the money they'd gotten from who, and Zeman's appears not to be moving. However, in December, the billboards, we suddenly start to see this, Zeman Again. So we suddenly start to see a billboard campaign, which must have cost quite a lot, not financed by Zeman's official campaign, but by a body called the Society of Friends of Miloš Zeman, which was a body of political associates of Zeman, which relaunched his political career when he came out of political retirement to run for the presidency and to come back into politics. I think he relaunched himself in 2009 to 10. So it wasn't quite clear who exactly had paid for these billboards, but the stress is on simply showing him as being presidential, reminding his supporters that there is an election and they need to turn out to vote for him. Here's another one. It says, who is more trusted than Miloš Zeman? So a fairly innocuous 1st round campaign. Obviously, Zeman does have his detractors, so here one of these billboards has been defaced with the response, Baron Munchausen is more trustworthy than Miloš Zeman. Zeman did, as the 1st round showed, did, however, have a significant base of support among, on the whole, poorer, older, small-town voters. And it's important, I think, to take a figure like Miloš Zeman seriously. He's very widely depicted in the Western media and by kind of liberal commentators as just a sort of boorish, vulgar, almost comic figure that nobody could take seriously. But it's clear that Miloš Zeman's voters did take him seriously. So focus group research, the kind of words associated with Zeman are that he was open, he was direct, says what he thinks, clever, intelligent, sensible, close to ordinary people. So in other words, although Zeman's supporters can't have been blind to his faults, they nevertheless were prepared to look past them, and they probably saw these as simply underlining his authenticity. The word upřímný there means sort of honest and sincere, but it sort of conveys the idea of authenticity. He's a what you see, what you get politician. And Zeman's politics, which are on the left and were broadly about sticking up for Czech national interests, appealed to this group. Zeman's detractors, as I've mentioned, saw him as vulgar, uncultured, old, ill, arrogant, and so on. Drahoš's ratings among Zeman supporters, one word comes up, this word here, neznámý, which means unknown. They simply don't know who he is, he's inexperienced, he's boring, he's dull, and so on. Drahoš's supporters see him as respectable, trustworthy, serious, honourable, decent, cultivated, educated, but none of this really conveys a great deal of enthusiasm. And as polls later showed, about over half of those who voted for Drahoš voted for him to stop Miloš Zeman. Now, as I've mentioned, the first round result was disappointing for Zeman. He underpolled, and in the 2 weeks between the first round and the second round runoff, there's a change of tone in Zeman's campaign. Zeman is known as a very combative politician. He's known for his brutal put-downs and his kind of lumbering witticisms. He's also fond of kind of quoting philosophers and Latin tags and so on. So we see a much more offensive campaign, and these are the billboards which start to appear. Stop immigrants, stop Drahoš, this country belongs to us, vote for Zeman. So Zeman is really reminding voters of his position on immigration, his nationalistic or patriotic credentials, and he's trying to paint Drahoš, who is really quite a politically ill-defined figure, as a sort of typical Prague liberal who wants to open the doors to immigration. Now, we should say that, in common with other Central and East European countries, the issue of immigration is a puzzling one. It clearly does concern voters, and there's a deep fear of immigration, but there isn't actually any immigration. Especially in the Czech Republic, which wasn't one of the main countries of transit during the European refugee crisis. The 2011 census indeed shows that there are more people whose religion is Jedi Knight than Muslim in the Czech Republic. But puzzlingly, the social fact is that across the region, including in Poland, the fear of immigration is a very real one. So Zeman is making this point. And he made this point in TV debates. He had avoided TV debates with anyone. He now agrees to 2 debates. One on commercial television, which was like a kind of game show. It was like something out of Jerry Springer, with the audience sort of cheering and whooping. A rather more serious one on state television. Zeman was considered to be a much better TV performer than Drahoš, but in fact, I'd say the debates were rather inconclusive. Zeman did look unwell, but he performed kind of okay. Drahoš was nervous, but especially in the second one, he performed kind of okay. Now, one thing I was always asked by journalists who rang me up, I mean, every 4 or 5 years, I kind of get my 15 minutes of fame as someone who knows about the Czech Republic. And journalists this election rang me up and asked me, what about the Russian connection? Where's the trail to Moscow? Now, Miloš Zeman is a politician who is accommodating towards Russian interests, who wants sanctions against Russia, EU sanctions scrapped, who sees a source of business in the former Soviet Union, and members of his entourage do have connections with Russian companies. But there's no real trail that you can unravel. There are news servers which have emerged as important in the Czech Republic, which are sort of local equivalents of Breitbart. So this one here, Parlamentární listy, is a very widely read news server whose ownership is very, very unclear, which includes a mix of news with a kind of illiberal and nationalist slant. It reports an awful lot on immigration, social problems in Western Europe, and it has a mix of straight news with the occasional bit of fake news thrown in. So it's quite a sort of sophisticated mix, but it has a very clear focus here. So here's a story about allegedly the first Muslim abusing Prague citizens and so on. So it has a particular slant. There's another one, Proti Proudu, Contraflow, which is here making fun of Jiří Drahoš, which is run by Václav Klaus's former Chancellor Hayek, which is rather more tabloid and aggressive. So these are important and play a role, but really the story is much more a domestic one with domestic roots. So that's the story of the campaign, and that's how we get to that second round win by Miloš Zeman, which really underlines, he's ill, he's not really performing that well, but he still manages to pull off quite a political success. So what does it all mean? The focus, I've said, is very much on Russia and Putin, and journalists want to view the Czech Republic as a kind of part of a political chessboard in a new Cold War. Now, the Czech president doesn't have many formal powers, more of a figurehead than an executive. There's an ill-defined role in the constitution which gives him or her a foreign policy role. There's powers of appointment to the central bank board and a few other places as well. Zeman, like other presidents like Václav Klaus, indeed perhaps like Václav Havel, has used the position to sort of carry out a personal foreign policy which is often at variance with the real foreign policy of the Czech government. So here he is visiting Putin, and that is going to go on. So the optics will be of the Czech Republic as a sort of illiberal populist country, the same way that when Václav Klaus was president, the optics were of the Czech Republic as a very Eurosceptic country. Probably what matters more, though, are the domestic consequences. We've mentioned here that the last election has seen the emergence of the guy on the right, Andrej Babiš, the Slovak-born agrochemical billionaire, leader of the ANO party, charged with fraud, prime minister designate for the second time. He and Zeman have had a close informal political alliance for the past couple of years, united by the fact that they dislike the old traditional established parties which formed the Czech political landscape since the mid-90s and have been gradually disintegrating. There have been signs in the campaign that the Babiš-Zeman kind of bromance is disintegrating. Babiš seems to have reservations about Zeman's more kind of illiberal statements. He's labelled the Czech Trump. He wants to, when he can talk anti-EU and opposing illegal immigrants with the best of them, and indeed, in fact, all Czech parties oppose quotas, including Drahoš, liberal, including the left liberal pirates. So he's not alone with that. But Babiš was critical of Zeman's first-round performance. He said he didn't seem pro-Western enough. He said he's surrounded by some fairly questionable characters in his entourage. He said Zeman had made mistakes by not appearing on television, by appearing to hide from the public. And Babiš didn't appear at Zeman's kind of celebration party. So there are signs that this is kind of unravelling, but what will matter is Miloš Zeman's domestic role. In his first term, he's already shown himself to be a politician who has very minimal regard for the Constitution. In 2013, he flouted constitutional conventions by appointing a so-called technocratic government, which wasn't supported at all by the country's political parties. He's made statements to the effect that he can creatively interpret the Constitution. He thinks he thought he could dismiss the Prime Minister but leave the rest of the government in office. That's almost certainly unconstitutional. So he's made various other suggestions about what he might do. For example, that if Andrej Babiš doesn't win a vote of confidence on the third attempt at forming a government, Zeman would leave Babiš in office without having won a parliamentary majority for the remaining 4 years. Most constitutional lawyers think that the Czech constitution says parliament needs to be dissolved then. So Zeman has been really pushing at the boundaries of the Czech constitution, and having enjoyed this victory, we can expect more of the same. He may, however, fall out with Andrej Babiš later on. He doesn't need Andrej Babiš anymore. He needed him not to run a candidate against him. He's been re-elected, and so we may see developments. But Zeman will be a player, and he's someone with the ability to upend the Czech political system. His foreign policy positions matter much less. So what does it all mean? The Guardian reported it this, that the elects the far-right president Miloš Zeman. So journalists really want to tell a story of right-wing populism across Europe. Everyone who's vaguely kind of anti-establishment, critical of the EU, is kind of forced into this far-right kind of populist box. Now, the story is in Central Europe is far more complicated, and the notion of the far right, which is really reflects the West European experience, whereby outsider parties kind of came from the fringes to push in established parties. That's not the model in Central and Eastern Europe. All of the so-called far-right populists are really what we thought were mainstream politicians who've sort of broken bad. So we look at Viktor Orbán in Hungary. He's someone with impeccable opposition credentials, starts as a liberal, moves to the right, appears to be a kind of local version of Christian democracy, is a member of the European People's Party. He hasn't emerged from the fringes. Same with Law and Justice in Poland. They're a conservative party. They're not easily categorizable, but they sit and still sit with the British Conservatives for the moment in the European Parliament, in the ECR group. And it's the same story here. Miloš Zeman is an established figure who's very, very well known to Czechs, who has a social democratic background. The far right, so clearly he has these illiberal positions and this populist language, but he's not far right. This photograph attracted a lot of attention in the Czech Republic. It's Miloš Zeman kind of giving his victory speech. And it attracted attention because of the people in the background, and you can see various aides and business people and fixers and media men. But this guy was the one who attracted attention. He's Tomio Okamura, the leader of the Freedom and Direct Democracy Party, the newly resurgent Czech radical right. He's been a big Zeman backer, and there he is, standing behind or close to Zeman. So this is where Zeman is someone who draws support from the far right, and he even spoke at Okamura's conference. Absolutely inconceivable for previous Czech presidents. On the other hand, though, if we look a bit more closely, we also see this person, who's Milan Chovanec, who is the acting leader of the Social Democratic Party, former interior minister, someone known for his, let's say, social conservatism, so he backs the right to bear arms. He was a tough interior minister, so those very small numbers of refugees who found their way to the Czech Republic were imprisoned in harsh conditions, in prison-like conditions, which were criticised. But he's a social democrat leader, and he's standing there. So this kind of really symbolises where Miloš Zeman is. He's a kind of social democrat who also stretches out to the radical right. And if we look at Zeman's speeches, which are actually quite interesting. I've been watching them all weekend. They're more interesting than you would think. Zeman's speech to the Okamura's party, half the time he's telling them off for being unpatriotic and not backing the Czech military's involvement with the UN. So Miloš Zeman is a kind of strange hybrid figure who has a social democratic background, who still sees himself as a social democrat, who said the worst thing in his first term was the way the Social Democratic Party declined, but who also has a more illiberal and nationalist and populist appeal. Now this really, for me, This really tells us something about the course of Czech politics. Miloš Zeman is, as I said, is someone who's been around for a while. He starts off in that black and white photo there as one of a group of technocrat politicians who come into the Civic Forum movement, which overthrows communism. Then he's very, very I would say right-wing, but he's someone who's warning the public about the consequences of economic reform. Then in the top left photo, he becomes leader of the then very small Social Democratic Party, an insignificant minor party led by returned exiles, and he makes it into an effective opposition to the free market right which governs the country. Then he's Prime Minister between 1998 and 2002. His government is considered quite successful. It prepares the Czech Republic for EU accession. It cleans up the banks. And then Zeman retires to his cottage in the Bohemian Moravian Highlands. And he's not seen for 10 years. He falls out with his party when the presidency was still indirectly elected. He was Social Democracy's candidate, and large numbers of Social Democrats MPs refused to vote for him. Zeman leaves the party. He writes some splenetic memoirs, which were a bestseller, which my predecessor at CEAS, Kieran Williams, described in an academic review as, quote, a foul fart of a book. I don't think that's language you usually see in the pages of those journals, but it's really, vindictive book. Then he emerges to become president with this independent campaign in 2013. He's seen as an improvement on the Eurosceptic Václav Klaus, at least initially. And then we have the Zeman of today, this strange hybrid of a right-wing populist and social democrat. And in many ways this gives us the arc of Czech politics, the effort to create so-called standard Western European type parties, how that doesn't work, and how we then see figures on the inside reinventing themselves as outsiders. Like all effective populists, Miloš Zeman is an insider who can present himself as an outsider, and this very strange situation whereby he's meeting the leader of the far right. So Zeman's kind of career shines a kind of light onto the broader development of Czech democracy. Now, the last thing I'll say is that the campaign was very much a referendum on Miloš Zeman. And there were issues which weren't touched upon. There was migration, of course, but that's very much a kind of phantom menace. One issue that's not touched upon is the Czech Republic's direction within the European Union. Czech public opinion is very hardened against accepting refugees, so all politicians are kind of rejecting the quotas that the European Union said countries must accept of refugees. We know that. But there's also very, very high Euroscepticism. The Czech Republic was seen in the 1990s and seen after that because of Václav Klaus as a kind of Eurosceptic country, when in fact it wasn't, and Klaus's right-wing voters voted for him despite rather than because of his right-wing Thatcherite Euroscepticism. There was always higher Euroscepticism because there was a substantial tranche of communist voters who were left-wing and Eurosceptic, but really, now that Václav Klaus is off the scene, the public has swung behind his Euroscepticism. So if we look at these figures from the summer 2017, we see that a huge 39% of Czechs disagree even with membership of the European Union. It's very, very high. In Poland and Hungary, where governments have been in conflict with the EU, the levels of opposition are much lower. Miloš Zeman has even said he favours EU membership, but he wants a referendum on the Czech Republic's membership. That isn't going to happen. Prime Minister Babiš has ruled it out. He's a billionaire. He does a lot of business with the EU. That's not the Czechs are going to stay in. But we can see a huge Eurosceptic mood. The issue really of does the Czech Republic go into a possible core EU, or does it stay in some kind of second sort of outer EU? really the Czech Republic's interest, its position, its links with Germany would dictate going into the inner core, if possible, but Czech public opinion opposes this. And these issues weren't debated at all in the presidential campaign. They weren't really debated at all in the October parliamentary elections. Issues of refugees sort of stand in as a kind of substitute problem. So this is really the dog that doesn't bark. This is, I think, the real below the surface in Czech politics. And there you see more of the same. National independence is more important than effectiveness of the EU. There's the euro, and we can see there that Czech public opinion, which was once very supportive of euro membership, the country is of course obliged to join the euro under its accession treaty, has completely turned around after the euro crisis. So really that is the underlying issue that isn't addressed in the presidential election. So I'll finish up on that point.